We are going to continue our exploration into pre-Darwinian thoughts on evolution. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace may have arrived at the same conclusion at roughly the same time, but there were those who were so close to getting there before them that it's a shame those efforts have been forgotten. And today's subject is no different. And talk about forgotten efforts, this one is a perfect example. If I were to say the name William Charles Wells, what would you think of? My guess is that you would come up with nothing. And to be honest, I had no idea who he was either until I began researching this subject a few years ago. He's most often referred to as W.C. Wells when he's referred to at all. And what he had to say may or may not surprise you. It did me.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
It's no secret that one of the things that Charles Darwin paraded out of the shadows as evidence for evolution by natural selection were examples of animal domestication. These, he felt, were perfect for showing that changes do occur over time. Changes that modify the shapes, sizes, temperaments, and breeding habits of animals ranging from cattle and sheep to dogs, plants, pigeons. In fact, it was pigeons that really captured his imagination. Here were animals that underwent changes over time, represented by generations of breeding. Granted, it was man who directed these changes, not nature, but Darwin's point was that it happens and that we are already aware that it happens. Otherwise, breeders wouldn't have jobs. They step into the role that natural selection plays by choosing which features they wish to see developed. One could argue, as I do, that it is still natural selection even when breeders are involved. It's all a part of natural processes inherent in the evolution of species, even if we are consciously selecting for certain changes. The fact that we unconsciously do so when selecting who we ourselves mate with is really no different. That's sexual selection, and it still falls under the umbrella of natural selection. And I know I'll get a little pushback on that one, but the end result is the same. Small changes over time due to a selection process, whether it be an unconscious selection process or a conscious one. Add up enough of these changes, and you'll eventually end up with an animal which can no longer breed with the original model. That's a new species. Darwin collected his ideas about domestication and modification in a book that was published in 1868 called The Variation of Plants and Animals Under Domestication. It was quite an achievement and represented 4 years of work and research, but, and there's always a but, he wasn't the first person to be intrigued by what he saw in the results of animal domestication. Let me introduce to you W.C. Wells. William Charles Wells was born in 1757. He is actually an American, although his parents were both Scottish, and they had settled in South Carolina 4 years before he came into the world. He might have been a product of the New World, but the Old World refused to let him go. And throughout his life, he would travel back and forth between the two continents. His first time back was to study at Edinburgh. This led him to a career in medicine, which he pursued in cross-Atlantic trips for quite a number of years. He served as a medical apprentice in Charleston and studied to be a surgeon in London. He was also somewhat of a hothead. Or, if not a hothead, he wasn't one to be pushed around. One story was, or has him, serving in Holland as a surgeon. He was connected to a Scottish regiment at the time, and he had an apparent falling out with his commanding officer. Now, whether this was due to ill treatment, as some versions go, we'll never really know, obviously, but the end result was that he wanted out. So he was dismissed from service, but not after challenging that commanding officer to a duel. Duels were more common than you might think. Condemned by many but practiced by a few, duels were fought in the early days by sword, but by the time that W.C. Wells challenged his commanding officer to a duel, pistols were all the rage. At the same time that this event took place, there was even a set of rules developed in Ireland to organized duels called the 26 Commandments. And I'll stop right there, as this isn't the history of dueling, although fascinating, and I've come across a very few strange dueling stories. But what we are concerned with today is the travels of W.C. Wells. After his ill-fated stint with the Scottish Regiment, Wells went back to America, where he settled down in St. Augustine, Florida, and became, of all things, a publisher. He was so taken by the art of publishing that he established the very first weekly newspaper there called the East Florida Gazette. And this lasted for a year, and I was actually able to track down some images of the Gazette, which you can see in the show notes. And never one to be tied to a single place for long, Wells retired the Gazette in 1784, and he moved back to England once again to resume his practice in medicine. Talk about a rolling stone. It is here that our concern with the life of W.C. Wells really picks up. If you recall the episode on James Hutton, you will already know that ideas on evolution don't necessarily follow from somebody incessantly thinking about it. Hutton started out as a chemist, where he made his money, and then he went on to geology, where he made a name for himself. His thoughts on the evolution of animals was virtually buried in that work. The same goes for W.C. Wells. The paper that gained him recognition and that earned him membership in the Royal Society of Edinburgh was an essay on dew. And it's exactly what you were thinking. It's the dew that you find on the grass in the morning. Back then, prior to Wells presenting his paper in 1814, people thought that dew and frost on the ground caused cold air. It was Wells who tested and concluded that it was actually the temperature of the air and the ground that caused dew and frost to form. The 1800s was quite a heady time for science. A year later, he published the paper, but he also included another essay that he had presented to the Royal Society the previous year, and this one had nothing to do with dew, but had everything to do with the color of one's skin. Wells was of the opinion that the color of someone's skin does not, nor has it ever, indicated the presence of another species.
The blackness of the skin in Negroes is no proof of their forming a different species of men from the white race.
This paper came about after observations he made upon seeing a young patient with a skin problem. The paper was called An Account of a White Female, part of whose skin resembles that of a Negro. It was this paper that later saw publication along with his essay on dew in 1814. Wells said that the difference between people with different skin pigments was too subtle to be noticed. So subtle that even the most well-trained anatomist wouldn't see any difference if one were to look beneath the skin. He likened it to someone with a resistance to smallpox compared to someone without a resistance. There is nothing that one can observe to actually see the difference. There are people who find themselves resistant to a disease and others who aren't. It also applied to large groups of people who live and are located on entirely different continents. Remember Darwin's assertion that the domestication of animals provided evidence that animals can change over time into forms and shapes completely different than the original? Well, this applies or also applied to subtle changes within an organism, or even changes like, say, skin pigment, as well as disease resistance. Wells grabbed hold of this observation decades before Darwin and ran with it in a passage that could have easily been taken directly from Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
What was done for animals artificially seems to be done with equal efficiency, though more slowly, by nature, in the formation of varieties of mankind fitted for the country which they inhabit.
A very Darwinian sentence. Here, Wells, in no uncertain terms, is pointing out that mankind is not immune to nature's ability to modify an organism's features over time. It took Darwin over 10 years to publicly apply his thoughts on the evolution of man after he had first published his masterpiece on the origin of species. That was in The Descent of Man in 1872. Darwin was always cautious that he had enough evidence to support his views before actually presenting them. Wells, in contrast, was not.
Of the accidental varieties of man, which would occur among the first scattered inhabitants. Someone would be better fitted than others to bear the diseases of the country. This race would multiply, while others would decrease. And as the darkest would be the best fitted for the African climate, at length they would become the most prevalent, if not the only race.
Sadly, this was to be the only instance that Wells was ever to write on the subject. 3 years after being elected to the Royal Society, and also after having received the esteemed Rumford Medal for his due essay, W.C. Wells died of heart failure. Any further thoughts he may have had on the subject died with him. Darwin himself acknowledged Wells' contributions in the following passage taken from a letter that he wrote to Joseph Hooker in 1865.
Talking of the origin, a Yankee has called my attention to a paper attached to Dr. Wells' famous essay on dew, which was read in 1813 to the Royal Society, but not printed, in which he applies most distinctly the principle of natural selection to the races of man. So, poor old Patrick Matthew is not the first, and he cannot or ought not any longer put on his title pages, discoverer of the principle of natural selection.
If you are wondering who Patrick Matthew is, stick around for next week's episode. I think you'll like it. And I would like to think that Mr. Wells would be pleased to know that 200 years later, we haven't forgotten about him or his work. I hope you enjoyed today's show. There are many ways that you can help to support the show and to keep it alive. And to learn more, just head on over to evolutiontalk.com. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback on today's show, please let me know by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.